So today, somehow for the first time, I'm going to be looking at the Orient Bambino. Now this specifically is the 38mm version. I've had hands-on with the 40mm in the past, but I just don't love it. So let's take a closer look at this one. So we have a diameter of about 38.4, a lug to lug of 43.7, height of just 12.5, and a lug width of 20mm. Some other specifications, we're going to have the Orient caliber F6724 movement being away in here. It's going to have an automatic, very relatively unfinished, no real actual striping or, anglage or anything fancy like that. It is just a workhorse type movement. We do have a 40-hour power reserve though, and it is hacking and hand winding, which is also a nice touch. The watch has a domed mineral crystal here. It doesn't really state if there's AR coating on the inside or the outside, but the mineral crystals tend to not have too much of a glare in most situations, so it is pretty good outside. The watch is rated to 30 meters of water resistance, but it only has a regular push-pull crown. Of course, not really a water watch. And lastly, really, the watch retails directly from Orient for $420, at least for the quote-unquote limited edition versions. Don't really know what makes them different. I just really the color on the dial. Don't know why they're really upcharging for that. The standard version of the watch comes for $385, and apparently the 40mm are closer to $280. So really, why is there a $100 upcharge? I'm not quite sure either. So that is the pricing. You can find these on sale or on eBay for cheaper, but that's what is the manufacturer retail price. So starting with the dial, and I think they did a really beautiful job here. Not only do I think the dimensions of this watch are awesome, but I think the simplicity and the way they actually faceted the markers are done in such a way that it looks very premium, especially considering the price point. I completely forget what this handset is called. It's very Journe-esque. I'm sure it's been used before them, and I do think it has a name, so I'll put it somewhere below. But it's a beautiful handset. It's kind of like a thinner, more elegant sword-style hand. I like it. It mirrors the indices beautifully. It has pretty much the same shape for the indices. They're a little bit thinner. They also have that multifaceting to it. You'll see it a little bit more once we zoom in, but it has a facet on the back edge, as well as, I wouldn't really call it a facet, but they have a cut into the middle. So it's a really cool effect. It catches the light beautifully, as you can see. It really plays, it really captures, and it just makes the dial feel more alive than if it was just a regular kind of two-dimensional marker. We, of course, have the printed seconds track along the outside, classic Orient lion logo there, just a little bit of text, Orient automatic, and water resistant at the very bottom, which is, not very water resistant, so I don't know why they put that necessarily. They did a pretty good job on the dial overall, especially with the coloration here. We have this very matte, lacquered, painted type feel to the dial. I shouldn't have said lacquered, because lacquered usually feels more glossy, but it has this beautiful matte, gentle appearance to it. It has this beautiful robin egg blue type of color, not quite Tiffany, not quite light blue, but a nice, interesting color. I do think at times it can be a little desaturated, at least in my opinion and in my preference, but it is nice and very different from the typical darker and navy tones we typically see with blue dials. We, of course, have a date window. We have a little step down to the date window as well, which is a nice touch. And really, that's it for the very plain dial, and let's take a closer look at it. So taking a look at the dial up close, and we can see there is a lot of beautiful detail to see. I mean, the metal applied portions are done well. Again, like I said, they catch the light beautifully. We have a bifaceting to the actual handset, so it really sometimes is dark on one side, light on the other, sometimes fully lit. And it has a really nice interplay between those light and dark elements. The indices, again, like I said, have a similar effect to them, but you can see there, it is more of a little valley taken out of the middle of that index. It's kind of a weird style that I haven't seen before. I mean, I do like it. It gives it a very pointed and interesting appearance, but it's just something I've never seen done in a watch index before. It's a little hard to capture with the curvature of that crystal, but you can see there, the very edge of the marker kind of is another face faceted down and away towards the edge of the dial, and then it comes up to a point where it is then those two facets on either side, which are the bulk of the marker. Those as well are pointed a little bit towards, slanted on each other side. So the right side slants to the right, the left side slants towards the left. And it is just a beautiful marker, really just shape, and the way it plays with the light is really nice. When we're getting close like this, you can start seeing the quote-unquote price point of the watch. You can see there is a little bit of waviness or graininess to the metal on those indices. It's just one of those things where sometimes, you can't get the world for the price point. It is well done, I think, especially considering the price. There isn't a lot of very terrible QC. There isn't a lot of like scratches or marks or dust on the actual markers themselves, especially not on the handset. But it is just one of those things where sometimes you're not going to get the utmost quality. These are a very beautiful and very clean handset, and something that I honestly wouldn't have expected at this price point. It's really well done, and honestly cleaner than a lot of handsets I've looked at. It's almost really Grand Seiko-esque in how clean and just nice it pops. Looking at the text for a moment, we can see although it is large and they did use a varying typography, it isn't the most thick printing or the most thick kind of pad application. I would have preferred it to be a little bit thicker. As it is, it's really not bad. It's very serviceable. It's very readable, which is also good. And really, a lot of the metallic elements are shining the best here. Like that logo looks pretty amazing. The little touch of red in there. It just look really nice. Focusing on the date window for a second, again, you can see how it is framed, but more of a step down framing. It's cut into the dial, which I think is a nice touch. It adds a little bit of architecture to the dial that wouldn't have been there otherwise. Pretty just standard white date window, nice black text on it. Nothing really to write home about necessarily. You can see from the crystal, you kind of get almost a framed seconds track effect at some points. It really is, again, just a glare from that actual crystal domage. I'd be very happy to receive this watch overall, and I think there's really not much to nitpick. So taking a look at the watch in natural light, you can tell, of course, it just takes on a monotone. It doesn't really get much brighter or much dimmer depending on the shade or the amount of sun you get onto the dial itself. The indices do shine beautifully. They do kind of gradually play with the light depending on the angle and depending on what light source you're getting. And it is just a very pretty looking watch in shaded light. By comparison, in natural sunlight, more harsh sunlight, you're not getting as much reflection from those metal portions. You're just getting pretty harsh sunlight overall. The dial gets a little bit lighter in terms of the tone just because you're getting a lot more light onto that dial itself. But it is still very good looking. There's not really much I can say wrong about it. Thankfully, you're not getting a lot of crystal reflections overall because it's domed and acrylic. Here's just kind of a beauty shot. This is how the watch will look every day on wrist. This is a little bit more shaded light, but I do think it kind of comes together and looks really nice on wrist and looks pretty premium and has a little bit of flair about it. So moving on to the case of this watch, and while not the most interesting on first impression, really just not really much going on overall, I do think it's still a relatively good case, and it does showcase a little bit of finishing you wouldn't have expected at this kind of like level of watchmaking, quote unquote. You do have a very simple, super rounded case. You have a little bit of kind of curvature to this bezel, or kind of a conical nature about it. The domage of that bezel helps in giving it that rounded, soft shape. You have a very defined lug structure that just pops out from the case itself, giving it a very circular, round, case, but body to the watch overall. You can see the lugs themselves also have a little bit of curve down, a little bit of curvature to them. You can see, it's not the thinnest case overall, but I think it wears its thickness well. You do have a little bit of that height hiding in the case back, a little bit being taken up in the crystal, and the relative mid case that you see appears very thin, especially on wrist. They also did a thing where they brushed the mid case, and I think that really helped it almost thin out more because every element is polished otherwise, and then just this nice vertical brushing here on the side, which actually is done very well, is the almost really smallest part of the side profile of the case, and that is what's giving you a perceived thickness of just this tiny little part. Didn't quite mention it yet, but it's mainly high polished for the entire case, polished bezel, you have it polished for all the lugs and kind of top facing of the case. An interesting point is the bezel ends just before the edges of the case end, so you get this little stepped effect on the edges. And it's cool too because, again, the bezel is sloped, but then the actual base case is flatter. So you get this meeting of two polished angles, of polished joints really, that kind of play against each other and I think look pretty cool. Of course, the vertical brushing on the sides of the case, full high polish on the back, again, see-through case back, nothing really to write home about. You do have a kind of almost bear motif in the movement here. A little eye, little ear, little ear. This is not quite the Oris bear, but I guess we can call it the Orient bear, whatever floats your boat. But I guess maybe that architecture gives them something interesting to talk about rather than the finishing that is not here. And one thing to note, and I honestly haven't dealt with a lot of the Bambino range, at least recently, but I think this is a specialized strap for this, quote-unquote limited edition run, and this is actually a really good quality strap. It isn't my favorite execution of being like really artificially padded. You can see like that midsection really pops up, but it has this suede Nubuck kind of texture. It is super pliable, especially, I mean, really right out of the box. It conforms pretty well. You don't have the same, you have more of a kind of probably fake calf on the back. But the top part, super silky, very nice appearance, and very nice feel in the hand. And yeah, it just wears comfortably. I think is a really good strap, and one of the few times you get a strap on a watch at this price point where you go, I really don't have to throw this away. Of course, a little signed buckle, no quick release, so maybe I think that would be nice to see in the future, or at least include drilled lug holes because that makes strap changing just a little bit easier. But other than that, simple clean case, little signed crown for Orient there, and nothing else to really write home about. I think it's great. I think the dimensions are really nice. It looks pretty good. So, I mean, let's get it on the wrist. Earlier, I was wearing this. I don't quite know how to say this brand. I'm just going to call it AG. Maybe that's how you say it. But I think this is probably one of the best value watches that exists as long as you're okay with quartz. I think is a good kind of quote-unquote foil to this guy, which is, you know, maybe the best value dressy automatic. And as a caveat, best value if you're not considering AliExpress type brands. And there you have the watch sitting on my 6.5-inch wrist. I think it wears pretty well. The lug to lug isn't too long. The case again itself is only about 38 millimeters, so it's not too big overall. Pretty nice presence. It doesn't wear really too high up off the wrist, or doesn't feel too thick in my opinion at all. The 20 millimeter lug width I think is perfect for this size, gives it a good stance without being too overbearing. And again, comfortable strap. It's something I would personally replace at some point in the future, but thankfully this still gives you a lot of life out of the watch until you get to a point where you don't want to, you know, wear the strap anymore. Looking at it from the side view, you can see, especially when you flex your wrist, a lot of that case back just hides into the wrist. It feels very thin, you know, overall. Super comfortable, no sharp edges. The crown doesn't really dig into the wrist at all, even if I wear it super high. If I wear it further back where I have closer to a 6-inch wrist, still fits within the bounds of my wrist, starting to reach that, you know, border point where it might start being slightly too big, but still very wearable. You just kind of have to see whether or not the length of your wrist is compatible with the lug-to-lug distance, really. And something I think they just did really well with this watch design is they left a lot of empty space on the dial, a lot of negative space. The markers are relatively thin. They start the thickest at the edges and thin out towards the very center. So it's one of those things where it feels like a very open and expansive dial, especially for 38 millimeter. So a lot of people can wear this and have it not feel too small. So moving on to some other straps. This one is by Deluxe. I believe they call this Babelle leather. I'm not quite sure. I'll have it linked down below. But I think it looks great on the watch, especially because you have this relatively desaturated light blue dial. I think adding tones that complement in a bigger saturation or a larger saturation to contrast it look pretty nice. And I think this is a little bit more contrasty than this very, you know, sandy, grayish, brownish color. So I think this works well. Gives a little bit more life to the watch. Overall, it's a lot thinner than the stock strap as well, so helps it, if not actually wear better on your wrist, at least appear like it's wearing better on your wrist. So super comfortable. I think it's a good combo, and yeah, nice blue and brown combo. Now this I think looks pretty killer. This is of course a Cork strap. This is by Theo and Harris in collaboration with Jean Rousseau. Would I necessarily recommend this strap? Probably not, because the watch is, you know, you'll probably find it for like, let's say $350 and the strap's like $180 or something stupid like that. So you can probably find Cork other places. I know I've bought some from, let's say, Watch Gecko or something in the past for, you know, let's say $40 instead of this. So you can find something equivalent, but I think this texture, something again, a more relatively desaturated brown than this, but something still with more contrast than this more grayer brown color. Or I guess more cementy type tone. I think looks good on the watch. It adds a little bit of texture because again the watch itself really isn't textured at all, so it's nice to add a little bit of flair in the strap itself, and looks pretty cool. Changes up the look a lot too, and I think it looks pretty nice. A nice way to mix it up, a little bit more of a darker, more serious tone, this gray Nubuck strap from Deluxe. Much more neutral, much more versatile than the other lighter tones of strap, and this kind of lets the dial shine the most as well. Looks pretty good. Again, like I said, lets the dial shine. One thing to note is with these Nubuck straps, I've ordered these from Deluxe a few times. The first time I ordered it, I had to reorder it like 3 different times, and they charged me 2 of those 3 times because for some reason you order a 20 millimeter and they come as in a 19.5 or something, so you get a little bit of that gap, and you see the spring bar. So keep that in mind. Maybe find a different brand than Deluxe, but they usually have it in stock and it's ready to ship and it's convenient. So buyer beware kind of thing. And last but never least, a nice white silicone strap. This is not the Archer. This is just a random AliExpress $2 silicone. Beautifully plays off the light blue. When the markers kind of pop and get more bright and white, it really plays off the white tone of the strap as well. So really just cool option, nice way to mix it up, and again, makes it not really serious. The one thing I really love about the silicone straps like this too is that it is untextured. It's very kind of neutral. It doesn't really draw your eye away from the watch at all, other than if the color is kind of bright. But this one actually I think complements and kind of makes it feel like a whole, rather than, oh my god, look at that strap and then we'll look at the watch. Feels very cohesive, looks pretty good. Again, super comfortable on the wrist. You can wear this in all types of weather. The only bad part is, you know, you can get a little bit of fuzz and stuff attached to it, but not the end of the world. So pros and cons with this watch, and for me one of the biggest pros is going to be the size now. With the previous Bambino versions, I never felt like it fit quite right, at least on my wrist. It's usually a little bit large. The strap width is usually a little bit weird. You're usually looking at 21 millimeters. So with this version at 20 millimeter strap, 38 millimeter size, the proportions all around, the lug to lug, the relative thinness of the watch, it just fits really well, at least on my wrist. Another big pro for me for this watch is I think there's a lot of great detail going on, a lot of attention to detail paid, and a lot of tiny little watchmaking things you wouldn't expect for the price point. We have a genuine domed dial here, which is complemented by the domed crystal. It has a unique rounded nature you're not getting from every other watch, and honestly I would say 90% of regular watches have a flat dial surface, so you're not getting as much depth, you're not getting as dimension with those watches. And it's nice because if you have this watch, it stands out from your other watches with that domed dial. On top of that, you have multifaceted indices, multifaceted hands, and at least for my model seems like the finishing is pretty good. So hopefully that's continued throughout the rest of the range and the rest of the production, and you get a nice looking watch that plays with the light well and is finished well. My last pro for the watch is I think it applies a little bit less to this exact model, but I think the Bambino range in general is pretty well priced. You're usually finding them under $300, if not under $200 some of the times. With the newer 38 millimeter, it might be just slightly above that $200 price point. And I think that's good for what you're getting. It's a relatively in-house movement. It is, again, I think pretty in hand. It looks good, it's finished well, and it works perfectly as someone who, hey, this is going to be my only dress watch, and it's not breaking the bank at that price point either. And it, again, for what you're paying, you really can't complain. I wouldn't mind, you know, comparing this to a watch that may be $500-600. The only thing you're really getting is maybe some refinement in case shape, some slightly better finishing and brushing, but it's not that drastically different. Now moving on to cons, and while pricing isn't a con, I'll just mention it really quickly. The pricing is now very confusing for the Bambinos. I have the Orient website up here, and that's even more confusing because they have the suggested retail price and they have a sale price. I don't know if it's one of those things where it's a permanent sale now on their website or not. Digressing. Every single size is really a different price point. Like if you're looking at the regular 40 millimeter Bambinos, you're getting those for around $200 on the website as of currently. Whereas if we're looking at the 38 millimeter version, non-limited, we're looking at $270. $70 more, and it's just a smaller case. There's really nothing else different about the watch. So I don't really understand the price difference there. I mean, sure, it's newer, but I don't know if that really should affect anything. On top of that, the version 7 limited edition, which is kind of what this is part of, is $330 on the website, which is another $60 more than the standard version. Why is it that much more? I don't think it should be necessarily. Is it a better strap? Sure. Is the strap worth $60? No. Don't really know what's happening. So that's a very weird thing. Orient needs to get that under control. I don't know why everything's a different price point. It seems very confusing. Now onto my true cons, and especially with this model in particular that I reviewed, I don't like how desaturated it was. It's a very subtle color. It's not the most pretty to me. I think I just like saturation in general, and it's one of those things where if I'm going for this light blue color, I want it to be vividly pretty and light blue and kind of fulfill that color hole in my heart, or however you would say it. It needs to really fill its purpose. And with this one, I think it starts to get there, and it lets me down a little bit because it's so monotone, or it's so almost matte in its appearance most of the time. And if it was matte and more saturated, I'd be okay with it. But as it is now, it lets me down just a little bit. That's personal preference. You might like it more than me, I'm not sure. But I do think if you're looking for a really nice, deep colored, deeply saturated light blue dial, this is probably not it. And realistically, I don't have many other cons with the watch. Sure, it could be finished a slight bit better in terms of the case finishing. The brushing isn't amazing. The case shape's relatively basic, but that's not a bad thing. Basic can be good at times. So this is relatively a great watch. Again, the pricing is very weird. I don't like the limited edition nature because this one I'm reviewing is quote unquote the first limited edition that came out about a year and a half ago. And I don't even know if they said how many pieces it was limited to, but it said it was limited edition. And they recently came out with basically the exact same watch with a different strap and called it a limited edition again. It's a very odd thing. I think they're just trying to cash in on limited edition hype and FOMO and all that good stuff. Don't like that. Just make it a standard production. Be transparent about how much you're actually limiting it to. If you're gonna create another one, make it more different, make it a different color or more saturated or have a texture or something, I don't know. But digressing, final thoughts, and I do love the watch. The Bambino is, well, I'm kind of late to the party on this. Everyone's reviewed the Bambino at this point. But the Bambino has always been a great value watch, a perfect dress watch, and a great way to dip your toes in to see if you like a dress watch, because it's not the most popular category of watches. It's my favorite, but it's not going to be yours necessarily. So this one does a lot of things that dress watches do compared to sports watches, and it does it well. And it does it well enough for you to decide, is this a category that I like? I think from a watch nerd perspective, there's a lot to love here. There's a lot to love here from a guy who's only buying his first or second watch as well, because it has a see-through case back. You can see the mechanics. It's, again, a well-done watch for the price. And if you're spending $200, $300 for the first time on a watch, it doesn't feel like you're ripped off, which is a good thing. Let me know if you have a Bambino. Let me know if you're considering a Bambino. I do think personally the 38 probably is the best version of the Bambino, so let me know what you think about that. Do you prefer the 40? I could see people with larger wrists thinking that, but enough of my rambling. Thank you as always for watching the video. If you have any questions, comments, queries, leave them down below, and I will see you in another one.